Hello, my name is Lee Presser. This is my show. I speak frequently to very interesting people. Some of these conversations are so exciting, so intellectually stimulating, I thought others might like to listen in. This is the reason we started recording Conversation with Lee Presser.
Welcome to Conversation with Lee Presser. Education is a form of learning in which the knowledge, skills, and habits of a group of people are transferred from one generation to the next. While many Americans have a Norman Rockwell view of public education, to others, public education has become quite controversial. There is a list of topics some want taught in schools, others deeply oppose those topics and have their own agenda of topics which they believe should be added to the curriculum. In addition, there are divisions about competency testing for students and for teachers and teacher tenure, neighborhood schools versus regional schools, how schools are funded, and what influence, if any, the federal government should have over local schools. To address these and other issues is Dr. Kathleen Sullivan Brown, Associate Professor in the College of Education at the University of Missouri-St. Louis. Dr. Brown studies educational policies, practices, especially those involving state and national reform agendas. She has authored or co-authored over 40 research studies, articles, books, chapters, and monographs, and has presented over 50 papers and scholarly presentations at state, national, and international professional meetings. Dr. Kathleen Sullivan Brown, welcome to Conversation.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Glad you're here too. I've seen you on other television programs before, and I was impressed, and so I decided to put you on the list, and you've accepted to be here.
Sure.
Thank you. My point in the introduction is that when you and I were in school, education didn't seem controversial at all. At least maybe because we were young, we didn't know that it was. But today, just the educational process seems controversial. As a professor of education, why do you think, am I reading that correct? Is it?
I think that is correct, but I think it is controversial today, but I think it's always been controversial. I think going back to the beginnings of schooling, formal schooling in the United States, there have always been controversies about who should go, what they should be taught, who the teachers should be, what the preparation of the teachers should be, what it costs. And then we got a split between the public education and private schooling that was connected to religious organizations. So there have always been controversies about school. It just depended upon what was the focus of the particular controversy. We had controversies, for example, over the education of Native Americans. We pulled them out of their communities and put them in what we called the BIA schools, the Indian schools, and taught them English and Western culture, our Western culture. There have been controversies as each wave of immigrants have come through to our country. The Irish, the Italians, the Germans, each group, their culture affected what was happening. In some ways, negatively, in the sense that we wanted to remake those people into Americans. And we constantly were defining, I use the quotation marks because we were constantly defining what it meant to be an American in the 1840s, in the 1870s, in the 1920s, and now in the 2000s, 2014. And our definition of being an American was changing. All of that, school is just sort of a reflection of society. School is a very special social institution, and some people think that it helps to shape society, and it does, but it's also shaped by the society. And so it's very much a reciprocal kind of relationship. You don't have schools in a vacuum. They must reflect the society that they are part of.
Now, schools are not a charity. It costs to run schools. Now, check me on this. This is my understanding. If we were to be in this area of the country, say 150 years ago, This would have been wide open farm country, and a group of farmers would want their kids educated, but they don't have the training to be able to educate them properly. So they would call out east, and they would find some school marm and bring her here to this area in the Midwest. They would build a building. They would tax themselves.
Right.
They'd set up a group. They would tax themselves. They'd build a building, and the tax would also be able to pay for the school lady and for the books and the things that were needed.
Mm-hmm.
Is that essentially correct?
That's sort of
started?
the history of the common school, right?
Okay.
What we called the common school, and that name is a little misleading. The reason it's common is that it was supposed to be a common experience. Everybody was supposed to get a common or shared education. It's not common in the sense of pedestrian.
Right. Okay. Now, so then we move forward in time. So now you've got, let's go another generation or two. Now we have a lot more people. There's more than farmers. There's some city folks. We now have some buildings that are in the city. And there's still this this school system that, you know, we've taxed ourselves. We're building these buildings, and we from the community elect leaders who are going to make decisions about what the school is going to do. The things you mentioned, you know, what we're going to teach, the slant that we're going to have when we teach. Some people would say at some point in the 20th century it flipped. And now all of a sudden we have administration telling the school board and telling the parents, this is what's good for you and your kids.
Right.
Okay. Even though the parents are actually the ones doing the paying of this administrative group that's telling them what's good for them. Am I reading that essentially correct?
Well, I think to understand education today in our world, it's helpful to go back to that one-room schoolhouse, and even farther back to the colonial era, when there were no formal schools. We had an apprenticeship model, and work and schooling has always been connected. You had to learn a trade, you had to learn a skill. And generally what you did is you went to a master craftsman and you studied and watched and observed, and then you tried it out on your own.
So you learned how to be a carpenter,
Right,
how to be a
exactly.
painter, how to be a blacksmith.
Right. And one of the important early skills was literacy. As our country grew, we needed people who had literacy and numeracy skills. Back in Europe and other parts of the world, there were very few people who were literate. It was only a unique elite group that could read. But in our country, very quickly, we wanted people to be able to read, in part to read their Bible. We wanted people who had numeracy skills so they could help with commerce.
Run their farm.
Run the farm, understand what happens when you rotate your crops and all of that. So life is getting more complicated as we move through this history of education. The connection between the economy and education is strong, and as our economy gets more complex, schooling gets more complex. The types of skills that people need, we go from building one-story buildings, which we had in this area with the French in Cahokia, to building 20-story buildings. The skills to do that are different. Now you're looking at architecture and engineering and science, the rise of medicine. So as our economy is becoming much more complex and differentiated, you have many more occupations and skills. All of that has to be taught in the formal school operation. We don't have the apprenticeship model. We still have it, but we don't have it as much. We have to bring people up in large numbers with those basic skills, literacy, numeracy. So as these waves of immigrants are coming in, the population of our cities is soaring. It's hard for us to even imagine today. We have immigration in our region, but nowhere near the number of people coming in that we did in the 1870s, 1880s.
I think Texas and California,
Well,
they might understand right about now.
They might, but even then, we had millions of people coming into our country in those days. And it was a huge shock to the system of education. So in the early 1900s, we kind of adapted, as I said, we reflected society. What was going on in society was standardization, mechanization. So we looked at Henry Ford and we said, he's got a great idea there. He put things on an assembly line. Why don't we do that in school? We'll put everybody in an assembly line. We got bells and whistles, and everybody meets the standard. And that was a way to get a lot of people through the system very quickly with standard skills.
But
Then
there was a requirement that they actually, when they came to the other end, that they actually knew something. And parents anticipated they were going to know something, right?
Right, and maybe they came out with what we would call a 5th or 6th grade reading level. Newspapers even today are targeted at about a 7th grade literacy level. So it wasn't necessarily that our ambitions were that high. But eventually, again, as the economy got more and more complex, we raised the ladder of education. So we used to have people stop at the 5th grade. My uncle, he got about a 3rd grade education, but he was a truck driver. He worked, he saved, he bought U.S. savings bonds. He bought a home with a 3rd grade education. But that's not something you can do today. In this economy, you have to have much higher literacy skills, now even technology skills. So we changed the organization and delivery of schooling from the elementary grades up into what we called the comprehensive high school, and eventually even to our colleges. And with our state colleges, under the land grant program, the farmers that you referenced before, the farmers were saying, we need to have more people who understand agriculture, who understand the science of farming. And so we brought the study of agriculture into our colleges to help our states with their agricultural economy. So it's a very complex relationship between economics and education. And you also can't forget that in our democratic society, it's not just about learning skills so that you can work, but learning skills so that you can do your most important job, which is the job of being a citizen. If you can't understand the issues of the day, like climate change, global warming, whatever you want to call it, if you can't understand those difficult concepts and you don't have the science background to understand, I heard a report the other day about is fracking creating more earthquakes? Fracking, where they inject water into the ground instead of drilling straight down for oil. Now they're throwing water into the ground and it makes the oil come up. So we're desperate for oil and we're doing this fracking. Well, in Oklahoma, they're saying we have 4 or 40 times as many earthquakes as we used to have. Is that because of fracking? So if you're a citizen, how can you make an intelligent decision about a policy or a law or a tax if you don't understand some of the basics of all of that?
Now, I understand what you just said, and I agree 100% that is essential. As a matter of fact, I was just reading a book about the founding of the United States, that period, and one of the reasons that they wanted schools was so that people could fully understand, so that they could maintain a republican form of government instead of having others who would rise up and dictate. But somewhere between, say, 1970 and 2014, this year, schools started going off the rails, because now in St. Louis County, and St. Louis City, you've got schools where kids are they're either coming out of school uneducated, or they're not even waiting around. They're just dropping out. I've had people, superintendents from this St. Louis City school system here talking about the problems that they have with education. And I know that you know something about this topic, and I'd like to switch over. What has happened from, say, 1970 to 2014 to somewhere like the Normandy school system, or the Riverview Gardens, or the St. Louis City Schools, or East St. Louis, which at one time East St. Louis was a good school system. So,
well, a number of things. I mean, books have been written about this, so it's difficult to
give us the comic version.
Right, I'll give you the 5-minute elevator speech. Basically, in the 1960s, when our government started with the war on poverty, they started to put money into programs for people who were not being successful in our society, and there was a movement then toward wanting to check on the money that they gave. So before that, schools were basically the responsibility of the state governments, and so the state was directing the policy. We didn't have a lot of people at the State Department of Education, so they were sort of a little bit distant. So most of your policy was created by your local school boards, your local administration, and teachers, the community, basically. So now you've got some federal money that starts coming in, and there began a process of wanting to be accountable. We hear that word a lot, accountability, accountable. And it comes from accounting. It's about the money. It's about where'd the money go, what did it do, have people been responsible with it?
I want you to pause there for just a second, because I want to point out to the audience, even though you said federal money comes in, as a portion of the total budget of those school districts, it's minuscule. It's minuscule, and yet they are trying, because they put $1 in, now they want $1 million worth of influence.
You're right.
Go ahead.
That's a good point. For example, around the country, states put in about 45% of the amount for K-12 education. Local communities, about 40%. And the federal government generally, with the exception of in recent years when they've put in some stimulus money, generally it's about 7%. So it's a very small...
And it depends on the district, too.
It depends on the district.
Some of the nicer districts get less. Some of the ones that have what's called failing schools, they get more.
Yeah, so it's a little counterintuitive to people. If you've got failing schools, why do you want to pay them more money? On the other hand, they do need more money to get where we want them to be. It's very confusing. But let's go back to the history. So the federal government starts to put some money into this, but they want to have some accountability. So we began a process of evaluation and tracking the money. And that led to lots of rules, much more complicated accreditation policies and so forth. And I lost my train of thought there. The accounting process, if you want to think about it as, checking up on the bills, the money going in, money going out.
Right.
What's it used for? And in those federal programs, you could only spend the money on certain things.
But somewhere in there, they lost track of the student.
Yes, they did. So we're spending so much time talking about the inputs and the outputs and the teacher. You're right, we lose track of the student, and we get too far away from what is the essence of education, which is the teacher-student relationship. When you begin interfering with that, when the teacher spends more time taking attendance and doing testing, we are testing now we're the most tested people in the world.
I mean, when we were in school, we had a couple of tests that we took, right? I understand, you tell me, because you're in the business, what is all this testing that they're doing? I mean, I can understand if you're in a school district where kids don't know how to read very well, they don't know their math, they don't know their science because they just haven't been taught or their parents haven't emphasized it. I can see testing to make sure. But when you're dealing with schools like Edwardsville or Parkway or Rockwood or Lindbergh, these kids, they're catching it already. They already know. They don't need to be tested to death.
Well, I agree with you. In a typical middle-class family in the United States, a child entering kindergarten is probably already reading. My own son, my two sons, were probably reading at a 4th or 5th grade level when they began school because they had two parents who were very strong readers themselves, spent a lot of time reading. We went to the library. We did all kinds of literacy activities. We controlled television. We went to museums. We played with words. We did jokes with words.
Well, you were the educator.
Somewhere, I was an educator. Well,
no, I don't mean because you are.
True, but
parents
were
the educators, the first teachers.
That's right. But a famous sociologist, William Julius Wilson, talks about when you have families in poverty and you have the kind of intense poverty concentrations that we had during the 1960s, which led to these poverty programs, you have whole neighborhoods where children see people not going to work, where they don't do these literacy activities.
Isn't that true because the parents don't know enough to know how to teach these things?
That's right. You have generations who they may have even gone through school, as you said, and not gotten the skills or developed the habits of reading and studying and learning.
Why isn't Missouri and Illinois focusing on that smaller group than trying to involve the entire population in these kind of testing and control programs?
Well, part of the issue is the whole testing anxiety and testing obsession comes from the fact another movement that was happening at that same time was the whole notion of IQ testing, which started with the military. We thought that we could test someone and then we could line everybody up according to how many points they got on an IQ test, right?
You're 110, you're 120.
Yeah, and so
90.
We had one definition of intelligent. We had one way of looking at success. And oftentimes it was a number that somebody stamped on your head that said, I got an ACT of 30, so I'm a genius. But I don't know enough to come in out of the rain, you know? So the educator, Howard Gardner, talks about multiple intelligences. When we talk about communities, we need people who are carpenters. That's a different kind of talent, a different kind of intelligence. I talked about building tall buildings. That's a different kind of intelligence. We need people who are nurses and therapists and counselors and clergy and all the other different skills that make up a community. Those take different intelligences. But we created a school system with this accountability, you know, again, obsession about numbers and who's first, who's second, who's third, who's not even on the team. And so it became this competitive race to be this number one, and it's the whole explosion of competitiveness and all of that. And then it became worldwide. So we're not just competing, you know, Maryville, Illinois with Edwardsville or Collinsville. You're competing with Singapore and Kyoto, Japan, and it's just gone out of control.
Well, we got about 4 minutes left.
Okay.
I told you that time would go by fast, and it does. I guess when we come right back to just that quiet moment again, and we look at generally the kids that I mentioned in those districts that I mentioned, when they come out of school, or even while they're in school, they know how to read, they know how to write, they know how to cipher, do math.
They know how to think.
Right. But you've got all those other districts that we talked about, St. Louis City, East St. Louis, Normandy, and Riverview Gardens, and others, where they can't even, you can't even get those skills or show those skills out of those children, irrespective of thinking. Maybe some of them know how to think, but they don't know how to do the basic things. It would seem to me that as a society, that if you're going to concentrate there rather than on everybody. Let's try to at least bring these guys up to, you talked about standards, at least come up to where they can, you know, read, write, do math.
Well, we could talk about this for hours.
And you can come back and we will.
Well, that's great. Part of the problem is if I go to my doctor and they put a blood pressure cuff on my arm, you know, and they blow it up, they can take a reading of my blood pressure. They can listen to my heart and check my heart rate. They can take a blood test and test for cholesterol or calcium or whatever. In education, the testing that we do is not nearly that precise. Mm-hmm. I can't take a temperature of a student and know exactly what it is. So what we have are these tests, these standardized tests or teacher-made tests that are supposed to give us feedback about what the child knows and what mistakes they're making so that we can intervene and help them. But nowadays, if you read the directions for most standardized tests, it says the purpose of this is not for diagnostic testing. That's exactly what we need is diagnostic testing. What standardized tests are meant to do is to put everybody in the pool and do what I said before, that competitive lining up. You're the best, you're the second best, you're the third best. That doesn't help with the learning part of it. So we have to get back to the idea of testing in order to help the teacher help the child learn. But the way we've done it, including with our state accreditation policies, is we've created these scorecards. And we're judging students not on whether they're good citizens, whether they go help their elderly neighbor, whether they go into the military to defend our country. We're judging the quality of our schools on the basis of some number that is isolated and, you know, out of context. So part of it is schools are about social values, community values. And if the community values, we got the best ACT score ever. Our kids are all going to Harvard, whether they belong at Harvard or not. They have there's this competition that is devoid of real education and learning values. So that's what we need to get back to. And that's difficult in our
You mean learning
competitive,
how to learn.
Learning how to learn,
Right.
learning the things that are of interest to you, to follow your talents and your giftedness, whether it's in art or in music or in medicine or in science or engineering or whatever it is. We have one definition of success, one definition of intelligence.
Unfortunately, we have run completely out of time.
Oh, dear.
I know.
We didn't talk about tenure at all.
Right. No, we didn't. So I have to go. I have to say goodbye. I've been speaking with Kathleen Sullivan Brown from UMSL. And for those of you who want, you can go to YouTube. You can see this whole thing again, and we're going to have her back. Thank you. Goodbye.